component of social change? What if we articulated that a more just world can't be such without the healing of the primal wound? What if the communal and collective weren't inherently separate or separated, but we made a collective agreement that they must be interconnected, so the actual individual healing is not a separate project from the collective process of justice and of healing? In our westernized culture, we have both individualized how people heal and process, and by doing that also shamed people that require healing. And if we acknowledge that as a collective body, that we all experience racial healing, and I will put that forward beyond people of color, but into whiteness, that there is racial trauma within the embodiment, the lineage and history of people of color, and also within the lineage and history as oppressors, as historical oppressors within the embodiment of whiteness. If we all necessitate this healing, but then we take a Western methodology of how we heal, which says you must do it in private, you must do it in secret, it will cost you a lot of money that often you don't have, and time that we also have commodified, so we say you don't actually have the time to do it, because if you aren't spending all of your time, as Monica spoke to earlier, the sort of doingness of church, and equally the doingness of social justice, we have made those paragons of how we live in the world, so you must be doing all the time. You must be healing in private. You don't have the resources if you're doing social justice or church work to get that healing, and we're not going to give you the time because we prioritized in a Western concept the doingness of things rather than the healing as an actual doingness in and of itself. So we shame it, and we shame people that require that experience without acknowledging that we all require that experience of healing. And then actually I do believe that the work of social justice and the work of faith and justice cannot be done in a way that actually works for us and works for the world. If we are not integrating healing into it, we're creating a problematic paradigm. I've been doing the last maybe 4 or 5 years more and more work working with social justice movements specifically and studying social movements as actually a traumatic experience in and of itself. So social movements are traumatizing. I spent almost a decade working with combat veterans, and I've never seen any other kind of trauma that mimics combat trauma like social movement trauma. It almost verbatim, symptom to symptom, looks the same. So that means that most of the people in this room, if not all the people in this room, are living an experience of war on our home front. And beneath that is the generational trauma, the systemic trauma of racial violence for everyone. And so we're actually building into movement culture that in itself is also traumatizing our experiences of individualized trauma. And what that means is we're acting out our traumas on each other. There's a phenomenon in neuropsychology that's called mirroring. So it's this idea that I mirror to you and you mirror back to me our state of being. So if you imagine our core state of being is traumatized, then we are just ricocheting our pain and suffering and trauma from me onto you and back again. So if we do not heal this core primal wound that is the trauma of race, and that is the trauma of this identity that we have created and constructed to call race, because of course race is a myth that was built on this conception that we must prioritize light skin. And so to do that, we must build a construction in which the darker you are, the worse you are. And going back to that idea of primal wound, that message getting sent, that you are worse, that you are less, that you are not good enough, that you are not safe, gets scripted and rescripted over and over again. And again, even in the conception of whiteness, being stunted and being as culturally stunted by this identification of not just difference, but prioritization around colorism, it creates a systemic problem that we're not fixing because we're out fixing all of the problems that we actually see as problems, which they are, right? And as was spoken before, in an era of Trump, there are real systemic problems. There are things that need to be addressed in this moment. But specifically, as I continue to study social movements, the movements are falling apart because we're not actually healing the core wound at the center And as a result, we just keep traumatizing and re-traumatizing ourselves. Which brings me back to that question of how we build a just world is contingent on how we heal. Because we can win a battle, because remember, it mimics so much like combat, we can win a battle towards some kind of just precept or ideology. But if underneath it, everybody still stays wounded and everybody still stays in pain and suffering, we actually haven't fixed anything at all.